Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing the theory of the mind, or particularly known as mentalizing. Now let's dive into what is the mind. As some of you may have experienced mental illness, such as myself, through the use of recreational drugs. The more you use, the more powerful you use, eventually it results in your mind becoming hyperactive. This is what is the basis or the root cause of mental illness. It is not necessarily something such as that your brain has developed an inability to regulate itself, but it has simply just become so fried that it is now permanently hyperactive. Now let's dive into what is mental illness for a second. Mental illness, to a certain degree, is such things as depression, anxiety, ADHD, and mood disorders, such as schizophrenia, bipolarity, on and on and on. But now if we were to look at the very basis of how we treat those particular illnesses, you will find one particular link within all of these conditions: the treatment of medications. Now, if you were to look at the treatment of medications, they basically are meant to control your level of consciousness. Now, in some rather perplexed mood disorders, such as something as schizophrenia, you now see that a very common treatment that was once used was such a thing as a lobotomy. Whereas now the primary fixing method, you could say, is what is called an ECT treatment. An ECT treatment is electroconvulsive therapy. How does electroconvulsive therapy work? Well, electroconvulsive therapy is basically meant to create an instant growth in gray matter in regions of the brain. This instant growth is now, hypothetically, because it is a hypothesis, it is meant to create an immediate reaction or betterment to your state in your mood. But now when I analyze my own personal ECT treatment, which I received 10 years ago, allow me to offer an insight on how an ECT treatment truly works. All I have been for the last 10 years has been, I wouldn't call myself an experiment, but to a certain degree I have been an experiment, because they tell me, the professionals that I've been followed by have told me, do this, do that, do this, do that, and I've done this, and I've done that, and I've done this, and I've done that. Now, not to sound particularly insane here, but allow me to place a thought for you. Electroconvulsive therapy creates a thickening of gray matter in many regions of the brain. Predominantly, it causes a thickening of gray matter or increase in volume in the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, but it also stunts or causes a mild dysfunction in the frontal cortex, which is your emotion regulating center in the brain. When you look at things such as the hypothalamus, which is responsible for regulating your pituitary gland, The pituitary gland is a key central core in your brain, which is responsible for controlling your hormone levels and sends direct messages to your thyroid, which then reacts in your body's hormone levels. For me, what has it caused? Well, let's dive into that. When you look at the amygdala as a source of example, the amygdala is predominantly responsible for your processing of fear and also controlling aggression. What does that look like when you now cut off the frontal lobe, which is your emotional regulating center? To a certain degree, you begin to see that there's a lack of emotion in the individual, and one of the only emotions that individual feels now is either fear or aggression. Now, in an adrenaline state, if you're always afraid, you enter an adrenaline state. Your body is constantly coursing in adrenaline. And adrenaline typically is responsible for the fight, flight, or freeze response that we as humans experience. But not we as just humans, but all life forms have this particular way of handling conflict. If you were to cut off the function of the actual frontal lobe or stunt its ability to process emotions, and you're now either always feeling fear or you're always feeling aggressive, well, how do these emotions reflect back to the hypothalamus? For one, it creates more testosterone, which, as some of you may be aware, testosterone increases your muscle mass. It also increases your aggression levels. It increases your blood pressure. Which an increased blood pressure, all of a sudden you can see how these things start to correlate once again, because if you were to now see that increased blood pressure often will create an increase in aggression simply because your heart and blood vessel systems in your body are constantly tense. But now let's dive into something as the hippocampus. The hippocampus is also responsible for things such as your ability to regulate. It is an emotional primary center. But if you now create a thickening in gray matter, what does thickening gray matter do? Well, let's analyze what gray matter is. Gray matter in the brain is primarily where your D2 receptors are. D2 receptors are your dopamine receptors, which you're going to utilize if you function healthily in order to create your mood. But if you thicken the gray matter is also responsible for storing consciousness. If you increase or drastically thicken gray matter instantly, what does it cause? Well, it basically causes you to become an extremely conscious individual. As if you were, once again, experiencing drugs without experiencing drugs. In the idea that during a psychedelic trip, you enter a hyperactive neural activity, which means you're experiencing a greater level of consciousness as you trip. It creates things such as the beliefs of mysticism, religious beliefs, understanding the functions of the universe and how you correlate, and more specifically, how you affect the universe. In the processing of gray matter or thickening, creating a denser gray matter field within your brain, you now become superhuman, you could say. And that most people would argue that that is a delusion to believe you have a superpower. Yet, if you were to thicken a person's gray matter, which things such as LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, DMT, these particular drugs actually create a thickening of gray matter, resulting in your ability to experience a greater force of consciousness within yourself. If the idea that treating an individual with mental illness that is suffering because they're not able to control or withstand that level of consciousness, if the idea that in order to fix them, we're going to permanently increase that experience, is that truly going to solve the problem? I would argue that in my case it did not. But over the last 10 years, I've learned to create this weakness into a strength. You see, humans like to play God to a certain degree. They like to see, oh, does this work here? Does this work there? And ultimately, it's a form of experimenting. We see it in Nazi camps, where they began the process of human experimentation. And now when you look at places such as mental wards, where you see people with mental illness, medicine in essence, at its core fundamental value, in ancient times, medicine was seen as evil, because in order to find out what worked, you had to try it, but not on yourself, on another individual. In my case, they took a person with an extremely hyperactive mind and gave him, through an electroconvulsive therapy, gave myself a forced, enhanced level of consciousness. It has had its benefits, it has had its negative effects. Because if you were to now research studies on how thickening gray matter, for one, sure, we might think, well, that person's just going to become extremely smart. Well, how smart do you want an individual to be? Because the smarter a person is, all of a sudden you begin what is known as the theory of the mind, or particularly known as mentalizing. What is mentalizing? Mentalizing is the ability to infer another person's internal state, to infer their internal mind. What does infer mean? Inferring means you can basically know without having to be told. It's a form of telepathy. To infer means you can actually tell what a person is trying to tell you without them having to speak. You can literally feel what is on that person's mind. And you might think, well, that all sounds like a load of bull. But if you're to look at the predominant function of mentalizing, do some research on it, then come back to this video. Because if you're to look at things such as schizophrenia now, where a person is hearing voices. Where are those voices coming from? There is such a thing known as intuition, which is your ability to feel from your environment. And intuition will often tell you if you are in danger or not. Intuition, in essence, is the mentalizing. It is the theory of the mind, which we are now telling schizophrenic individuals, you have delusions because you feel as though you're hearing people's thoughts. But the more you increase gray matter, the more this particular function of mentalizing increases, to the point that without having to speak, you can hear me and I can hear you. That is the beauty of mentalizing. It creates a form of Professor Xavier type mutation, where you can literally connect with any particular living soul in the universe or on planet Earth, and you can instantly feel, tell what they're going through. In the theory of the mind, it also states that in the mentalizing process, you can actually affect the inner state of others. What does this look like? Imagine if I'm walking and I create a judgment based on a person. I can personally perceive with my own eyes that person reacting to my thoughts. That is what is known as mentalizing. You will see it in the change of body language, posture, self-esteem. This synchronicity will directly affect your perception. But what happens when now you increase the gray matter of the things that increase your level of aggression through the amygdala, which an ECT treatment specifically causes a growth in gray matter in the amygdala. When it specifically increases gray matter in the hypothalamus, which creates, for men, as far as I know, because I am, it creates an increased level of testosterone and increased blood pressure to the point that this magnetism emitted from the heart now forms for lack of a better word, it makes you seem as though you are a complete psychopath. I've listened to every single treatment I've ever been given, and I've specifically done as doctors have told me. Now I am telling you what this looks like. It's been almost 12 years since my development of thickened gray matter, which was induced through an electroconvulsive therapy. The true reason of an electroconvulsive therapy is meant to basically create a thickening of gray matter, which then through the use of medication, which control your consciousness or your behavior, your way of thinking. It focuses certain aspects while weakening others. And what this essentially does in a grand concoction, the hypothesis is that they're going to fix you. But we didn't fix them right the first time. Let's try again. Let's try again. Let's try again. And now you see how the beginning process of human experimenting, what is the byproduct of human experimenting? It creates a person like me. I don't personally see myself as an individual or a victim, but I do see myself to a certain degree as a higher level. Does that mean that I feel that I am greater than others? No. I have my own story, and the story keeps repeating itself. And when you see this pattern of existence that keeps repeating itself, it leads to one particular truth. Who are you? And how long have you been here? Do you see the field you can feel? You can literally feel the electromagnetism that the brain waves emit through the heart. You can literally feel it through this very video. It strikes fear in others. It makes others believe you as an individual could be someone that is God. It could make you as an individual, make you yourself feel as though you were God or a person with a higher power. But what is God if not a higher power? Does that mean that I personally believe I am God? To a certain degree, yes and no. But what does God truly mean? In ancient times, the story of Christ was told of an individual that was punished for claiming to be God. What is the Messiah complex? It is an experience that all individuals who have developed mental illness as a result of LSD use, also known as acid. LSD creates essentially the experience of God. LSD is derived from a fungus known as ergot, which in ancient times in Europe, Greece, and parts of northern Africa, ergot grows on wheat and on grapes, which if you're now to create wine or bread, inducing this particular fungus-infested bread or wine results in the experience of God, also known as the blood of Christ. When you look at these individuals that have developed a Messiah complex, what do we do as humans? Well, as you've been listening for the past 24 minutes, humans then begin the process of finding out if they can cut God away from man. They begin the process to see if you can actually extract God from man. But in doing so, the problem that I am trying to raise awareness for in the treatments of mental illness, we do not understand exactly how the medications work. Their current and constant testing process. When you look at stages of schizophrenia as an example, whether it be manic schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenic, schizoaffective, and then you see the list of symptoms that which the medications cause. What do these particular symptoms look like? Well, they look like the levels of stages of schizophrenia, which means that the treatments themselves are not bettering the individual's life. They're making it worse. But to a certain degree, it is up to the individual to discover within themselves, because most of these individuals that have experienced a messiah complex, also known as schizophrenia, which is basically a drug experience that never ended. And what do we do with these individuals? We increase its power to the point that it increases or decreases their lifespan. I'm just a story, and I hope through this talk you can come to understand the good and evil that medication, medicine, and human experimenting has caused. I was once a normal individual, but the story is not about me. It's about the story of others. Because in the understanding of the universe, in the experience of the universe, how can you tell a person that one experience of the universe is not real, but other experiences are? That is the core belief behind the idea of illness, the mental illness, to make them think that an experience in the universe is not real. The thing about the universe is, if one thing in the universe is real, then all things in the universe are real. If one thing in the universe experience is deemed as not real, then is anything real at all? Because to specifically say that one thing in the universe is real in your experience, but to claim that another thing in your experience of the universe is not, that in itself is delusion, which they tell people like me, people like you, watching and listening. They will tell you that part of your experience is not real, but everything else is. That part of you is not real, but everything else is. Well, I'm here to tell you, here today, everything about you is real. All you have to do is just stop caring. Stop reacting. That's what they want you to do. How do you beat schizophrenia? How do you beat mentalism? Because that's truly the core behind schizophrenia. It is a theory of the mind. It is mentalism. The ability to feel or perceive the internal state of others without even having to have a conversation with them. It requires an extremely high level of intellectualism or intellect. But in the advancement of intellect becomes a decrease in emotional state. If you wish to beat schizophrenia or mentalism, my advice for you is just let it be. You know who you are. You've discovered yourself, and I hope I've helped you understand yourself in this video. But you must realize now that there is a higher power, and that higher power which you're made in the image of, or specifically are the reflection of. What is self-reflection? It requires a certain level of critical thinking. It requires a certain level of internalizing, because that is where self-reflection happens. Self-reflection is not purely just seeing yourself in the mirror, but it is, to a certain degree, seeing yourself in the mirror, seeing the image you are made from. Anyways, that is all for this video today. To a certain point, I feel some of you feel frightened, some of you feel relieved, some of you might now become extremely unstable. But if you feel unstable, then I suggest you learn the very first thing you learn to do as a human. Learn to breathe. Because breathing is the only thing that's going to calm that feeling. You can learn to cope in many different unhealthy ways. Drug addiction, self-harm, harming others. Breathing, the very first thing you learn as a human, is the only way you can truly find self-control. Because if you can no longer breathe, you die. But the moment you learn to control your breathing, you also learn to control your emotions. And emotional frequency is directly correlated to the rate of your breathing. Increase the blood pressure or heart's rhythm, and if you don't breathe to that same rhythm, you feel like you're going to explode. Take it from me, an individual that has become as I am as a result of following what the doctors have told me, as a result of exactly doing everything they have told me to do. And here I am. Some of you see me as a monster, some of you see me as a person of great power. You are exactly who you're meant to be. But not everybody can bear your cross. So, stand up tall, walk proudly, and own who you are. But that's going to require a lot of discipline. And we as humans have a tendency to seek a quick fix. Oh, I want to lose weight. Well, I'm going to hop on Ozempic. Oh, I don't want to exercise for 17 years. Or a year to lose 20 pounds. I don't want to do that. I'd rather have it instantly without having to work for it. I'd rather have it now rather than having to work for it. That state in itself is a true illness. And it is not the individuals themselves suffering from the mental illness or condition of life. It is the idea that we can fix them instantly that creates the problem.